We found that the male that was most attractive to women was the tender defender. And I feel like you're kind of describing a tender defender.
Man, I really want to talk to you about that. So I've been involved in an email exchange with Richard Dawkins. And I asked him to come on my podcast, and he wrote back very politely and in a detailed letter, pointing out why I wanted to talk to him, which was very surprising to me. I said I wanted to talk to him about sex selection, particularly. And then he identified a paragraph from a talk I did with Sam Harris that nailed exactly why I wanted to talk with Dawkins. Okay, so Dawkins is the blind watchmaker guy, right? And he's anti-teleological to the core, and also anti-religious, etc. And people know about Dawkins, and Dawkins is an admirable person intellectually, but the evolutionary biologists are not taking the issue of sexual selection seriously enough in relationship to value. So let's take what you just said. All right, so imagine this. You tell me if you think this is wrong, because I really want to know if it's wrong. Women do this too, but we're going to sex differentiate for the time being. Men organize hierarchies around tasks. They want to get something done. Okay, and it's something that everyone in the group wants to get done. And so as soon as they aggregate themselves towards the task, a hierarchy of competence emerges because there's individual differences. And if the group's functional, they let the guys who are better at the task rise to the top. Okay, now imagine that across tasks, there's a proclivity for some men to rise and others not to. And those would be men who are competent and generous across tasks. And so they're more likely to emerge as successful in the domain of task-related hierarchies. All right. Now we know that women are, what's the word? They mate across and up hierarchies. It's one of their
relational?
Yes, they're men mate across and down hierarchies. Women mate across and up. And that's obvious cross-culturally. It's ameliorated to some degree in countries like the Scandinavian countries, but it's there cross-culturally. They like men who are a bit older, and they like men who are a bit above them in the hierarchical game, let's say.
Okay.
Men, most valid man is, and women peel from the top. And that value game drives evolution. It's not random. It's not random at all. And so that's, you said tender defender. And I do think that's generous productivity. And so not only we're selected for that, and sexual selection specifies that even more completely and intensely. So men can gain that by displaying trappings of wealth. And like the pickup artist types, they mimic tender defender. And they can fool women that way. But women, by and large, are looking for cues for exactly that. Competence and the capacity to protect. The ability to protect. What else would you want for your children?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying links so much to Zahavi's handicap principle in evolutionary psychology, that you need honest, reliable signals. Women are pretty smart at seeing bullshit,
Well, the survival of their children depends on it.
That's why.
They're extremely smart at it, as they should be. And I don't believe that it's a misreading of the evolutionary literature to point out that one of the reasons that we have diverged so rapidly from our common ancestor with chimps, chimps seem much more similar to that common ancestor than we are, is because chimp females are non-selective maters, whereas human females are highly selective maters. And, this manifests itself in, if you look at these charts, they're quite comical in some sense. If you look at how men rate women on a typical dating site, it's pretty much a normal distribution. The average woman gets an average rating, and, the 9 out of 10 gets a 9 and so forth. It's distributed as you would expect, but it's skewed way to the left for men. Like 60% of men are like a 4 or lower. And so even in just instantaneous ratings of attractiveness, there's pronounced sex differences. So
you put it very well though when you said our survival or species literally depends on it. I love it. I just want to double click on that.
Okay, so then the question is, and this ties into this humanist idea, what is it that we're aiming at? Well, what part of that is, well, what are the elements that make up competence and generosity? Well, we know what competence is made out of: IQ and conscientiousness. That's a huge chunk of it. So in general problem-solving capability, that's IQ. Consciousness is diligent application of that. Okay, so then you pair that with generosity.
And openness, dare I say. And openness to experience, dare I say.
Yes, well, there'd be a niche there. Yeah. Because that's where you get creative types, and they can be radically. I think of creativity as a high risk, high return game. You're highly likely to fail. But
I'm just linking that to Jeffrey Miller's hypothesis about creativity being a reliable indicator of genetic mutation load, which is why it would be so sexy, from the selector point of view.
Oh, you'd have to elaborate out that a bit, because this is also the case for like all sorts of other species, right? Bowerbirds, for example.
Exactly.
And even fish, for God's sake. Have you ever seen those sculptures that pufferfish make at the bottom of the ocean
it's
floor?
incredible. It's very aesthetic.
Mind-boggling. Yeah. And they're beautiful. And they're complicated. And they take a lot of work. It's like birds select highly for creativity in many cases. And so you see this emerge out of an evolutionary process in species that are quite distant from ours. It points to something underneath that's common, that's common across creative fish and creative people. It's quite the damn gap.
Well, this goes back to like a lot of things we're saying, because like human intelligence, human creativity is so complex. It's very hard to fake. It goes back to like what I said earlier. You can't just accidentally get like a 170 IQ, even though there's lots of reasons why maybe lower IQ is misrepresenting your IQ. But this does relate to the fact that reliable indicators of these things are important from a sexual selection point of view as well as other points of view.
Well, that's crucial, because the blind watchmaker types, they say, well, evolution is just a random process. And there's unfortunate political and philosophical implications that instantly emerge from that. Everything's bloody pointless. There's no direction. There's no such thing as real value. It's like, wait a sec. There's random mutation on the creativity production side. So that life capitalizes on chance as an extra domain of creative production. And you see that in creative thought in people too, because there's a kind of a randomness about creative thinking. You open up the gates and let ideas mate, promiscuously, let's say. And so but there's no reason to assume whatsoever that the selection mechanism is random, especially when you add in sexual selection. And as soon as you introduce consciousness, I think you introduce sexual selection. And as soon as you introduce sexual selection, you introduce directionality. And so much for randomness. You can't derive... So the people, the processes that make the watch might be random, although, what's happening down at the genetic level is pretty damn complex, and even bacteria exchange DNA with each other. So there's a plenty of play down at the genetic level as well as room for mutation. But once you get up to the selection level, like to me, conscious choice is the fundamental determinant of evolutionary progress. And look, even Darwin, because Darwin was a genius, he stressed sexual selection much as natural selection, but biologists for 100 years never paid any attention to that. And no wonder, it's revolutionary.
To be fair, I do think Jeffrey Miller, I think he did a good job in his book, The Mating Mind, kind of bringing to consciousness of the fact that creativity may have evolved due to sexual selection processes, itself. Right. And as well as human consciousness itself may have evolved due to sexual selection.
Look, plenty of biologists have been assessing sexual selection in the last 30 years, but it was under stress to a huge degree for a long, long time. And it is a game changer, because sexual selection among human beings, I think, is more important determinant of successful reproduction than natural selection. I mean, they're the same at some level. Women are acting as the gatekeepers, and so they are natural selection in some sense. But how can you deny the role of conscious directionality in that? And I don't see flaws in my reasoning. I mean, it is the case that men arrange hierarchies around competence and generosity. Fundamentally, it's not power. Even bloody chimps don't use power. You know, baboons, they're a bit of a different story, but power is too unstable. And so, and I think it's of advantage to men, even though that gives some men a wider range of mating opportunities, because the net benefit of enhanced productivity, especially when coupled with generosity, is so high that the downside, you know, of the hierarchical ranking is trivial in comparison. You want the best warrior leading your raiding party, obviously.
I mean, we want the best person in power, whether it's a man or woman, right? I mean, we obviously want, you know, a really competent woman in power as well.
Of course, and men select competence in women too, but there's differential selection to some degree because men will mate across and down, whereas women mate across and up.